Good evening, everyone. I'm Grant Lewis. I'm one of the curators of our Michelangelo exhibition, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, a suitably theatrical conclusion to our programme of events coinciding with the Michelangelo exhibition. The aim of this evening is to provide a fresh setting for Britten's Seven Sonnets in the shadow of our exhibition, looking at the creation of both Michelangelo's original sonnets and Britten's settings, and hopefully finding and exploring some parallels between the two. First things first, thank you for choosing us over the Olympics. That was some characteristically bad planning on my part, and thank you also for coming here despite our depleted strength. As you should know by now, I'm afraid that at the last minute, both Alessandro Fischer and Roger Vignoles went down with lurgies within a matter of hours of each other. We wish them both very well. We did some frantic scrabbling around to keep the show on the road. We thought we might manage some live performance with just one of them, but without both and with no time to find replacements, we've had to fall back on recordings instead, and a slightly curtailed programme because Roger was also going to treat us to his unrivalled musical insights on each sonnet. I, for one, would have loved to have heard that. So it falls entirely on me to give you a rewarding evening. No pressure. I'll pull out what stops I have, but please relax now, as at no point will I attempt to sing myself. Certainly not before a glass of wine. Though they can't join us, Alessandro and Roger were enormously helpful and committed to this evening, and I want to thank them. But my biggest thank you for this evening has to go to Andrea Rauter, who is here, she's just up there, without whom this event simply would not have been possible. And I think she is channeling Roger and Alessandro's spirit here tonight. So thank you enormously, Andrea. First, an introduction. I'll keep you waiting just a little while. In the dark days of 1940, Benjamin Britten gave Peter Pears, then an aspiring, largely amateur singer, a present and a half. Settings for voice and piano of 7 sonnets written by Michelangelo. This was no surprise gift. Britten had probably been mulling the work for the entire 3 years since he had first met Pears in 1937. But in the intervening period, the project had acquired a whole new meaning as Pears went from being Britten's new friend to his inseparable companion, increasingly public companion, and Europe passed from an uneasy peace to all-out hostilities. Britten and Pears had actually left for America. Made as Britten was encouraging Pears's talent, the sonnets were meant for the two men to perform together as they started their new life together away from war-torn Europe, an expression of love and harmony in tempore angustiae. Many more gifts would flow from Britten's pen in the decades ahead as Britten and Pears committed themselves to life together. But for Pears, the Michelangelo sonnets remained one of the most treasured things he ever received from Britten. These were not simply private gifts for composer and singer, however. As the potential, the unique potential of Pears's youthful voice became apparent in these tailor-made works, interest in the sonnets only grew. And so in 1942, after Pears had made private recording and given invite-only performances, the works received a public premiere at Wigmore Hall. Further performances soon followed, appropriately enough, at the National Gallery, hot on the heels of Dame Myra Hess's celebrated concerts, Michelangelo's texts filling the void left by the 2 early paintings of Michelangelo's in the gallery's collection, since evacuated to a Festiniog cave. These first performances presented the British public with a new Britten, recently returned from America, especially given, as reviewers noted, his new interest in foreign language texts. In this respect, the 7 sonnets have had an important legacy, almost single-handedly keeping Michelangelo's poetry alive in at least one part of Britain's cultural consciousness. Now, Britten was a visually astute composer. He maintained close links with artists throughout his life. Here he is later in his life, sketched by one Milan Kosman. Yet Michelangelo was an interesting starting point for Britten to choose as his subject. Obvious to him, as we'll see shortly, but uncommon at the time. I think it's fair to say, despite our best efforts to promote Michelangelo's poetry in the show, it would still be unusual now, because Michelangelo's poetry is not such a well-known feature of his output, certainly not compared to his painting or sculpture, certainly not beyond Italy. Of all of the elements of our exhibition, that's the poetry that has attracted the least attention. And yet, poetry was an extremely important outlet for Michelangelo throughout his creative life. He penned, so far as we know, at least 300 poems, sonnets, and madrigals. And as Britten's settings reveal so effectively in so much colour, the poems are every bit as powerful as Michelangelo's other work. His writing is charged with an immediacy, a rawness of expression, and an extraordinary emotional range that can unfold in the matter of a single verse, a matter of lines. You need a voice as agile as Pears's to be able to capture all of the nuances of expression. There is, tellingly, an innate musicality in Michelangelo's poetry. There were madrigals, and centuries before Britten, Michelangelo's dear friend Giovan Francesco Fatucci described the poems as wonderful things to sing. Unsurprisingly for Michelangelo, it's also poetry that contains almost tangible pieces of imagery. Installed with a love of Petrarch, Boccaccio, and above all Dante, as a young man in Florence, Michelangelo started writing poetry relatively early, no later than aged 30, but his activity, at least his surviving output, increased rapidly as he reached his 50s. That is, in the 1530s, the moment we meet Michelangelo at the start of our exhibition. There were even moves to publish a volume around this time of his writings. And not only does Michelangelo write more poems as he gets older, but poetry becomes central to everything he does. And awareness of his poetry begins to spread more freely. The proudest I can recall Michelangelo being about a review of a work of his does not pertain to a painting or a sculpture, but rather a poem he penned in the late 1530s, which was the subject of a lecture in Florence, at the Florentine Academy, no less, by one Benedetto Varchi, which happened up to a decade after the poem was first written. Few things meant quite as much to Michelangelo as to see his poems treated seriously. To honour this strand of Michelangelo's output, we have included several of his autograph sonnets in the exhibition, formed, as you see here, in his exquisitely, enviably neat handwriting, deliberately modelled on printed fonts so as to render them worthy of admiration for their appearance alone. Here is my favourite of the ones we have, a late sonnet written as Michelangelo pondered the end of his life, Giunta il già il corso della mia vita, a poem in which Michelangelo renounces at the very bottom, in the last 3 lines, painting and sculpture as inadequate exercises for life's spiritual journey. What a thing for him to say. And yet he simultaneously conjures, in just a few words, a vision of Christ so powerfully tactile that one feels that only a sculptor could have written it. Right at the bottom, here neither painting nor sculpture will be able any longer to calm my soul, now turned towards that divine love on the cross that opened his arms to take us in. This vision of Christ on the cross in order to save humanity is born out of precisely contemporary drawings of the crucifixion that we've displayed by the sonnet in the exhibition, and also a wooden crucifix probably related to one Michelangelo began making shortly before his death when he is 86 or 87. And I think this is really important. Michelangelo draws and makes as he writes, as is increasingly the case in his later years. The poetry and the visual works are totally aligned in thought and expression. The introspection in that poem we've just seen is characteristic of so many of Michelangelo's sonnets, especially as he aged. But poems like that one we just saw were still sent around. It was actually sent to one Giorgio Vasari, famed author of The Lives of the Artists and Michelangelo's first biographer. Many of Michelangelo's sonnets, indeed, and especially the ones Britten chose, were made explicitly as gifts, presents for intimates and close friends of the artists. They are not then commissioned works like, say, the David or the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo had little or no say over the subject matter. Rather, they are works that he made because they meant something to him. Michelangelo spent a lot of time on the poems he made for others, and just as much thought. We see this very clearly in this remarkable sheet, again in the exhibition, a draft of another poem that we display, a sonnet that Michelangelo wrote for his friend, the equally brilliant poet Vittorio Colonna, in the late 1530s or early 1540s. What we're looking at is a draft that Michelangelo wrote for another friend, a highly respected humanist called Donato Gianotti, to read over for Michelangelo before he sent the finished thing to Vittoria. And so on the left, top left, we see Michelangelo's draft, again in his exquisite handwriting. And on the right, outlined in yellow, we have Gianotti's revised version, cleansed of some of the Tuscan dialect that Michelangelo so liked in his poetry and made more proper. Michelangelo never had a full grasp of Latin, and he was forever worried about showing himself up before people of letters like Vittoria. We have then a tantalizing parallel. Britten setting Michelangelo's sonnets as a gift, and Michelangelo also making sonnets as gifts. It's easy to see why Britten, seeing the same pleasing symmetry, was attracted to Michelangelo's poems as a subject. But Britten's focus was much narrower than that. He was overwhelmingly interested in the poems Michelangelo wrote for just one recipient, Tommaso de' Cavalieri. 6 of the 7 poems Britten set to music were originally written for Cavalieri, probably in a matter of a few years in and around their first meeting in the early 1530s, including some of the most famous verses Michelangelo ever wrote, Si come nella penna, se un casto amor. The 7th and final sonnet Britten set, the one that was not destined for Cavalieri, is nonetheless very, very closely related and was probably made around the same time as the other 6. Britten had hundreds of poems to choose from, spanning the extraordinary length of Michelangelo's career, and yet he chose texts that were almost as much a single corpus as his musical settings were to be. So why the poems for Tommaso? Because, simply, Britten thought he saw in Tommaso's relationship with Michelangelo and in the poems that Tommaso received something approaching his flowering relationship with Pears. Michelangelo met Tommaso de' Cavalieri in Rome in 1532. That is, at the very moment we meet Michelangelo for the first time in our exhibition. Michelangelo was in his late 50s, Cavalieri was probably in his late teens. Tommaso was renowned for his erudition, beauty, and, above all, his cultural refinement. What Britten probably didn't realize, as a small digression, is that Tommaso's son, Emilio de' Cavalieri, would play an indirect, if important, role in the development of what we now call opera. Well, someone reared in that pedigree, someone of Tommaso's cultural pedigree, inevitably left a strong impression on Michelangelo, and the two formed a close bond that lasted until Michelangelo's death. Cavalieri was still there at Michelangelo's deathbed, and he would play an important role in the years ahead, ensuring that Michelangelo's outstanding architectural works were to be continued, including, indirectly, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. So Cavalieri is always there, but the feelings between him and Michelangelo were especially strong at the beginning. Passionate, erudite, and often nervous, Michelangelo's early letters to Tommaso leave little doubt that he cared very deeply about his new young friend and that he had probably fallen in love. Within a year of their first meeting, so from 1532 to 1533, Michelangelo had made Cavalieri an unprecedented array of gifts, including a number of sonnets. Many of the sonnets Britten set were appended to the first correspondences we have between Michelangelo and Cavalieri, but also a number of drawings. Drawings, remarkably, that were not made in preparation for another project, as most drawings were, as most drawings you'll see in the exhibition were, but drawings that were made as works of art in their own right, brought to an almost unbelievable finish. We have two of them in the show, very generously lent by the king, which are surely among the greatest gifts any artist has ever bestowed on anyone. It feels a little wrong to squeeze them together on one slide, but never mind. On the left, we have a depiction of Titius. Titius having his liver eternally pecked out in punishment for his attempted rape of Latona, mother of Apollo and Artemis. And on the right, Phaeton, plunging to his death after an ill-fated attempt to ride his father Helios's chariot through the sky. Though he would continue sending Tommaso all sorts of presents in the decade ahead, there are more poems, there's a cartoon, there's quite a lot of homegrown fruit as well. This first flurry of presents to Tommaso was never seemingly repeated. So yes, there is much in this tale that would resonate with Britten in an almost typological way. The gifts, yes, but in particular, this first group of presents for someone who'd just become close to him. By making these presents, Michelangelo is almost modeling his behavior on Britten is almost modeling his behavior on Michelangelo's when Michelangelo first met Tommaso. And then, of course, there was the fact that the intense affection Michelangelo was pouring into letters and sonnets for Tommaso was unusually directed at another man. It's quite a moving thought, imagining Britten choosing sonnets Michelangelo wrote at the outset of his association with Cavalieri in the hope that he might enjoy such longevity with Pears. We will come on to what each of the poems says when we play the tape, but the overarching themes are love and longing in all its forms, and the allures of beauty, how very Michelangelo, not to mention art's merits as a vehicle for personal expression. It has been suggested, I think entirely rightly, that Michelangelo, and Michelangelo, particularly an antiquated Italian, allowed Britten to express his love for Pears under a cultured umbrella that would not arouse the same level of comment as works in English. One reviewer of the Wigmore Hall premiere complained, and I quote, that the words not printed in the programme sped past us at so rapid a pace that I can only remember the general impression. Mission accomplished, I think Britten would say. For those in the know, however, Britten's choice of Tommaso's sonnets was very telling indeed, reflecting a largely British, or else Anglo-German, intellectual trend. Back in the 19th century, indeed, John Addington Symonds, one of the 19th century's most vocal advocates of homosexual tolerance, had focused on Michelangelo and Tommaso's relationship as a model in a remarkably thorough account of Michelangelo. Indeed, it remained the main English language biography of Michelangelo for some time afterwards. And Symonds, importantly, was Britten's source for the Seven Sonnets. He borrowed a copy from one Marjorie Fass, a close friend of his from Suffolk, for which he chose the sonnets to set to music. Symonds usually publishes them in full. And he also absorbed Symonds's framing of Michelangelo and Tommaso's relationship. Without quite suggesting that Michelangelo and Tommaso were lovers, Symonds does intimate as much, and his text certainly invited such a reading. He was able to make use of then rather cutting-edge philological investigations into Michelangelo's sonnets, which had revealed that the male pronouns in the sonnets had often been changed to female ones in order to make them more respectable. This has been happening under Michelangelo's heirs. Borrowing Fass's copy, this was precisely the view of Michelangelo that Britten would have been encouraged to assume, of an artist smitten with a newly acquainted love. Now, whether Michelangelo's relationship with Cavalieri quite so closely mirrored Britten's experience with Pears, as Britten believed it did, whether Symonds's portrait is correct, is a matter of some debate. For what it's worth, and I got in quite a lot of trouble with The Guardian for saying this, but for what it's worth, I think Michelangelo's affections for Tommaso were probably far more Platonic, in keeping with contemporary Neoplatonic ideals that meant something in the 16th century, but have not had the same resonance now. But never mind what I think, for it was the homoerotic view of Michelangelo and Tommaso that Britten modelled himself on as he poured his heart out to Pears. Comparing Britten's output for Pears and Michelangelo's for Cavalieri, however, what interests me isn't so much Britten's deliberate emulation of Michelangelo's male-to-male gift-giving. What really piques my interest are some of the more circumstantial parallels between Britten and Michelangelo's circumstances and creative process. Parallels, I think, that were more unremarked than realized by Britten, parallels that pass subconsciously, parallels that I think might say quite a bit about what made both artists tick. This is all very speculative, frankly a little experimental, and I don't want to shoehorn in similarities just to fill the time I have left. But when we compare the two artists' working method, there are things that might be easily overlooked which suddenly come into sharper focus and become, I think, very interesting. These subconscious, serendipitous parallels actually extend to the reception of both Michelangelo's gifts and Britten's. What started out for both men as intimate, if not completely private presents, soon becomes public property. Britten on the stage of Wigmore, as we've heard, Michelangelo's in the continuous copies that were made of the drawings he gave to Cavalieri. We have some in the exhibition, some even made it in stone on the Marciana Library in Venice. That's how far these things are circulating. But the most telling similarity is that Britten and Michelangelo made gifts for similar artistic reasons, under pretty similar circumstances. Both, as we have seen, turned to making gifts just as that important person entered their lives. Britten seems to have been starting on the sonnets very soon after meeting Pears in 37, and they were ready as they entered into a relationship. Michelangelo began making sonnets and also drawings for Tommaso very soon after they'd met. The Phaeton on the right was finished within about a year of their first encounter, the Titius, a matter of months, even weeks. Then there is for both the intent that the gifts were going to improve the recipient in some way. Britten wanted the sonnets to hone Pears's still emerging voice. Pears was still an amateur when the songs were written, but thanks to them he found himself at Wigmore Hall, and the rest, they say, is history. Without me, he'd never have been a singer, Britten wrote years later. Michelangelo's drawings for Tommaso were also intended to encourage their recipient's artistic inclinations. According to Giorgio Vasari, the drawings that Michelangelo sent to Tommaso were intended to teach the young Tommaso how to draw. Now, this view has often been dismissed as unsatisfactory or as a cover for the drawing's real meaning as expressions of Michelangelo's desire. But I think Vasari was partly right, because several of the drawings gifted to Cavalieri, even the most meticulously worked of them, have rather crude drawings on the back that cannot, I think, be by Michelangelo. Here is the back of the Phaeton, filled with a pedestrian, often hesitant study of a female head that Michelangelo may just have touched up in places, as if correcting the efforts of a pupil. Both Britten and Michelangelo, then, made collaborative gifts, gifts that required input from the recipient if they were to realize their full potential. Britten, of course, needed Pears to sing the sonnets if they were ever going to make it off the page. But he also involved Pears in the work's protracted composition, trying out, it seems, musical ideas on Pears almost every day before the sonnet settings took their final form. And Michelangelo did precisely the same thing with Tommaso, involving him in the design of the extraordinary drawings like the Phaeton in a way that he never seems to have done with even his loftiest patrons, making sure that Tommaso was happy with the design before Michelangelo proceeded to make the finished gift. We know this because, unusually for Michelangelo's drawings, he wrote notes to Tommaso on the preparatory drawings he made for the gifts, asking Tommaso if he was happy with what he saw. That's right, Michelangelo cared so much about the drawings that he made for Tommaso that he planned them out with other drawings. Here on the left is one we have in the museum collection and the exhibition, a study for the Phaeton. And at the bottom, in the same chalk, we have a note in Michelangelo's hand. And here's what he wrote. Messer Tomao, so Tommaso, if you do not like this sketch, then do tell Urbino, that's Michelangelo's assistant, Francesco Amadori, acting as a courier here, so that I, Michelangelo, have time to make another one tomorrow evening, as I promised you. And if you're happy with it and want me to finish it, send it back to me. Gosh, Michelangelo being so hesitant and uncertain. This note conjures a rather wonderful vision of Michelangelo's courier hopping back and forth the short distance between Michelangelo's house and Tommaso with now absolutely priceless Michelangelo drawings. It shows just how eager Michelangelo was to please, or rather to make meaningful gifts that he was prepared to keep reworking his ideas, which, as we can see, he did, because the drawing Tommaso actually received is appreciably different from the sketch that Britten sent. The recipient, then, for both Britten and Michelangelo, is forever sparking and shaping their maker's creativity. Artists have always had, and always will have, their muses, of course, but I get the sense that both Michelangelo and Britten, in particular, were in need of a creative spark at the moment Cavalieri and Pears entered into their lives. In what is, I think, potentially the most interesting, precise parallel between the two men and their gifts, both Michelangelo and Britten found their muse at what were particularly difficult periods of their lives, moments of real upheaval. In 1937, just as Britten began contemplating the sonnets, he lost his mother, which had a profound effect on him. And as the sonnets took shape, there was, of course, as I mentioned, the onset of the Second World War and Britain's self-imposed exile of sorts in America. In the run-up to meeting Cavalieri in the 1530s, meanwhile, Michelangelo lost his father and his beloved brother Buonarroti in truly war-torn years for Italy that followed the disastrous sack of Rome in 1527. Michelangelo was very much involved in the fighting. It's a rather complicated geopolitical story, I'm afraid, but after Rome was sacked, the Medici were expelled from Michelangelo's native Florence, and a new Florentine republic was proclaimed. In the skirmishes, people were actually taking potshots at Michelangelo's David. As their authority crumbled, the Medici appealed to Michelangelo for help. They had, after all, reared the young Michelangelo in their own house, so it probably wasn't an unfair request. But Michelangelo instead ignored them and sided with the rebels, the Republicans. In hindsight, a very bad decision, as before long the Medici returned to Florence after a siege, a long siege that ended in 1530. Michelangelo had actually designed the fortifications trying to keep them out. And when they come back, the Medici enact violent reprisals on the rebels, leaving Michelangelo in fear for his life. To shore up his position, all he could do was integrate himself with the family again by working for them and their many allies. And the Medici and their allies dumped all sorts of projects on him, projects that he didn't always want to do, but had no choice but to accept, and projects that he simply didn't have the time to do full justice to. In 1531, so even before our exhibition starts, we get worrying reports that Michelangelo is about to die through overwork. That's our very inauspicious prelude to the 30 years you can see and celebrate in the show. And the result of all of this work, Michelangelo being pulled in so many directions, Michelangelo being exhausted after so much war, is, scholars agree, a loss of focus on Michelangelo's part in the late 20s and early 30s. Michelangelo, like Britten, absents himself as much as possible from his homeland and eventually settles in Rome. And then he meets some intimates that he makes gifts for, and chief among them was Cavalieri in Rome. And then in Rome, with Cavalieri, the creative juices start flowing freely again, and the gifts Michelangelo makes spawn all sorts of ideas that feed in to some of Michelangelo's most celebrated works, the works we celebrate in the exhibition, not least the Last Judgment for the Sistine Chapel, commissioned in 1533, so within about a year of Michelangelo first meeting Tommaso. You can see the compositional link between the Phaeton, the punishing God at the top, figures falling down. It all feeds perfectly into the fresco. The gifts for Cavalieri, then, as much as they were meant for Tommaso, as much as they might be meant to improve Tommaso, were also a way for Michelangelo to get back his creative focus, because he was in charge. He could choose the format of the gifts, and because these drawings are not large, he could lavish as much effort as he liked on them and still finish them, whereas so many recent projects had been left at a standstill after the recent turmoil. For both Michelangelo and Britten, then, these gifts were, from an artistic point of view, perhaps not entirely altruistic. They were a way for them, in difficult circumstances, to set their own creative agenda once more. And it's fair to say that they seem to have done the trick in counterbalancing the uncertainties surrounding both men. Cavalieri's gifts, as I just mentioned, meant that Michelangelo's creativity was fired up when the Pope came asking about the Last Judgment, while the sonnets sit at the threshold of Britten's fated career as a composer. Within a year or two, as the seemingly never-ending middle years of the war finally passed, he began setting his mind to the opera that was to become Peter Grimes. And with that promise of music, let us turn to the performance. Let us channel the spirit of Myra Hess and bring music back into the museum. The recording we'll be using in lieu of Roger and Alessandro is a recording with Pears and Britten at the piano from 1954, when Pears was very well established indeed. He just premiered Britten's Troilus and Cressida, and had also just sung the title role of Mozart's Idomeneo, just to give you a sense of the vocal breadth that Britten had relied on when writing the sonnets. Before each sonnet, I'll say a little about Michelangelo's original and read out a translation. After that, this is where you have to imagine Roger speaking great wisdom. Translating the sonnets is fiendishly hard, and translators have produced English versions that can have quite a different feel from each other, even though they derive from the same original. For this evening, I am very grateful to use translations by James Saslow, as his idea of Michelangelo and Tommaso's relationship, I think, well aligns with what Britten imagined. So, to our first sonnet of 7, Siccome nella penna e nell'inchiostro. This sonnet was written for Cavalieri within a year or two of Michelangelo meeting him. It was probably made just as Michelangelo's thoughts were turning from these beautiful drawings for Tommaso to the Last Judgment. By the time Michelangelo received it, he'd come to know by the time Tommaso received it, he'd come to know what to expect from Michelangelo. But for Britten, it made such a great opener, as it deals with first starts. It deals with the raw materials of the artist's craft and the beauty that lies within. Here's Michelangelo setting up love as a theme. And what better overture to a cycle of poems than the first line, si come nella penna nell'inchiostro, literally as with pen and ink. You get the sense of Michelangelo almost sitting down to write materials at hand. And some people have found in Britten's slightly Sturm und Drang setting the sounds of hammer hitting chisel into splitting marble. This is the next material that Michelangelo turns to as the sonnet evolves. So here is the translation in full. Just as with pen and ink, there exists the lofty and the low and the middling style. And within marbles are images rich or worthless, depending on what our talents can draw out of them. Thus, my dear Lord, there may be in your breast as much pride as humility, but I can only draw out of it what's suitable and similar to me, as my face shows. As earthly rain from heaven, single and pure, is turned into various forms by various seeds, one who sows sighs and tears and plains, harvests and reaps from them sorrow and weeping, and one who looks on high beauty from great sadness is sure to draw from it harsh pain and suffering. After that roughly hewn-out start, the soundscape becomes more intricate as Britten starts opening up to his beloved, as singer and accompanist better acquaint themselves as we move deeper into the sonnets. For me, the sonnets are best imagined as a journey as the performers get to know each other as the work progresses. This second sonnet is much more an outpouring of expression, lots of raw emotion. Once again, it was written for Cavalieri. There's a pun which you can look out for on his name in the final line, Cavalieri. The sonnet's not dated, but the imagery that Michelangelo uses often recalls the drawing of Titius we see on the screen. Perhaps Tommaso was meant to read the poem before the drawing, so we'll listen to Britten's setting before it as well. Here's the translation. Why should I still pour out my intense desire in weeping or in mournful words, if heaven, which clothes all souls with such fate, strips no one of it, either early or late? Why does my tired heart still make me long to languish if others must also die? Therefore, let my final hours be made less wearisome for these eyes, since all other good is worth less than all my pain. Yet at least, if I cannot dodge the blow I steal and rob from him, it is ordained, then who will win out between sweetness and sorrow? If, to be happy, I must be conquered and chained, it is no wonder that, naked and alone, an armed cavalier's prisoner I remain. In the third sonnet, Britten's musical sculpture, roughed out in the first sonnet and worked up in the second, receives its polish, with a tender, gentle melody. Veggio coi bei vostri occhi un dolce lume. I see in your eyes a sweet or gentle light. Britten paired this suitably enough with a Petrarchan sonnet that beautifully captures that gentle, mellow light. It's a sonnet in which we sense Michelangelo getting up close. We've gone from that rather abstract encounter in the first sonnet to a meeting between two people who know each other intimately. It's an intimacy beautifully described with the subtlest of accompaniments. Here's the translation. I see, with your beautiful eyes, a sweet light that with my blind ones I could never see. I bear, with your feet, a burden upon me to which my lame ones are no longer accustomed. I fly, though lacking feathers, with your wings. With your mind, I'm constantly impelled towards heaven. Depending on your whim, I'm pale or red, cold in the sun, hot in winter's coldest depths. Within your will alone is my desire. My thoughts are created in your heart, and within your breath are my own words. Alone, I seem as the moon is by itself, for our eyes are only able to see in heaven as much as it is that the sun illuminates. There the sun fades. And that serene calm that we just heard in the end of the third sonnet gives way to something slightly more agitated in the one that follows. This was, sonnet number 4, so far as we know, one of the very first that Michelangelo wrote for Cavalieri, when Michelangelo, clearly quite overwhelmed by the young Roman nobleman, was doing his best to ingratiate himself. We're probably talking the same months, if not weeks, as the Titius drawing. To judge from the letters Michelangelo sent, there were a few moments of awkwardness as Michelangelo reached out to Tommaso. He's ever worrying about how he came across. Here, as in the letters, he frames his intentions in spiritual attraction. You know that I know, my lord, that you know that I come closer to take delight in you, and you know you know just who I am. Why then delay our meeting any longer? If the hope that you give to me is real, if the great desire I've been granted is real, let the wall raised between them be broken down, for troubles left concealed have double strength. If I love in you, my dear Lord, only what you love most in yourself, do not be angry, for it's one spirit falling in love with the other. What I yearn for and learn for from your fair face is poorly understood by mortal minds. Whoever wants to know it must die first. The angst at the end there continues in the next sonnet, bubbling under a gentle melody before rising to the surface and then evaporating, as Michelangelo writes, of unsatisfied desire. This sonnet, sonnet number 5, was probably a slightly later one for Tommaso, written when Michelangelo was busy on the Last Judgment for the Sistine Chapel. He may even started painting when he's writing to Tommaso. Set by Britten, it has a candour. For Michelangelo, my guess is that it had a more abstract dimension. When it was written, that initial blaze of obsession which had resulted in the drawings we've seen had ended. The stream of sonnets carries on, but at a slower pace, and their friendship for the rest of their life was to be chiefly erudite. Give back to my eyes, O fountain and stream, the waves from that spring, perpetual but not yours, which swells and lifts you higher with stronger flow than you possess in your natural course. And you, dense air, who shade the heavenly light from my sad eyes and are full of my sighs, give them back to my weary heart, and clear your darkened face for my penetrating sight. Let the earth give back to my legs their steps, so the grass taken from it may sprout again. An echo, now deaf to my plaints, return my sound, and your blessed lights the glances to my eyes, so that I may love another with beauty once again, now that you are not satisfied with me. A jolt of energy now follows as we head to the finish, and Britten turns to one of Michelangelo's best-known sonnets, Se un gesto amor. This sonnet was sent to Tommaso together with the fourth of the sonnets that we've heard, and one other poem. Its imagery, raising both bodies to heaven on the same wings, strongly recalls another of the drawings that Michelangelo sent to Tommaso, a drawing of Ganymede that is probably lost but known in this deceptively good copy. There is some debate as to whether it is the original or not. You will find a very terse and turgid footnote on it in the exhibition book if anyone wants to buy it. As we reach the end of the cycle, here pianist and singer Britten and Pears join each other so closely together. There's the powerful sense of bodies coming together. Bodies that for Michelangelo probably meant something more platonic. The imagery of Ganymede had a long history here, but which in Britten's lively settings becomes a very immediate union. If one chase love, if one sublime compassion, if one fate are equally shared between two lovers. If the hard lot of one troubles the other, if one spirit, if one will governs two hearts, if one soul in two bodies is made eternal, raising both to heaven with similar wings, if love with one blow and one gilded dart can burn and rend the vitals in two breasts, if neither loves himself, and they love each other with one joy and one zeal, to such a degree that both might wish to come to a single end. Thousands and thousands would not make a fraction of such a love knot, such fidelity, and only anger could untie and break it. And so, to our final sonnet, Spirito ben nato in cui si specchia e vede. The only sonnet not written for Tommaso. We're not sure who it was made for, but it seems to have been penned around 1530, so during that same rocky period of Michelangelo's life following the sack of Rome. It's a celebration of the immortality of love, at the denouement of both the sonnet and the entire cycle. A beautiful piece of work indeed. Thank you very much.